All right, well, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to pick up here. In the last part, we were talking about um, types of fluid in terms of where you can expect to find fluid, so both inside the cell and outside the cell. We also talked about um, a little bit of how fluid moves. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a little while. Um, and then we talked about what you can expect to find in that fluid, right? So the different types of electrolytes and whatnot that you can expect to find inside the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. So what we'll do now is we'll take a moment to look at fluid balance. So fluid balance is exactly what it sounds like. The kind of balancing of the amount of water that we bring in with the amount of water that we um, uh, put out of the body, right? So that we lose. Now, as we'll see, we can lose water in a couple of ways, right? Um, we primarily bring in fluid in kind of one major way. There are a couple of ways, but the way that we get rid of water, we can get rid of water or fluid output in many different ways, and some of these you're likely already familiar with, right? So to maintain this fluid balance, and again, you can think about why fluid balance is important, right? So think about various other systems that we've talked about, that you've learned about. So think about, the role of fluid in the cardiovascular system, right? So think about it in the context of blood pressure. With hypertension and hypotension, think about it in the context of perfusion, right? You're sending blood and oxygen and all the nutrients out to our tissues. Think about it in the context of gas exchange, right? We're moving and exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide and waste products in our tissues and our lungs. Think about it in the context of our kidneys, right? We're sending blood to our kidneys so we can filter it out, right? So fluid balance is extremely important. So think about the different systems that are helping bring fluid in. Think about those that are getting rid of fluid, and then ones that help to regulate the process, right? So think maybe some aspect of the endocrine system, things like that. So if we look at fluid intake, right? Fluid intake is, again, exactly what it sounds like. We're bringing fluid into the body. The main way that we do this is ingested water, right? Ingested water. So you drink water, it comes in. This is sometimes called preformed water. You get a water bottle, you get your diet vanilla cherry Coca-Cola or something, and you drink it, and you're bringing water into the body, right? Now it could also be fluid from food as well. So whether that be fruits or meats or whatever it happens to be, you can bring in fluid that way. But the majority of that is through what we consume in terms of liquids, right? You can also have what's called metabolic water, and this is water that is produced naturally in your body that you are not actively ingesting, right? And so this graphic that you have down to the right is showing some of this metabolic water, right? And so this is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So this process here, we'll talk about it. In the future, but this is something called oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain. So this kind of row of proteins here moving electrons and shuttling hydrogen ions to one side of the membrane and making ATP. A byproduct of this is right here, water molecules, right? And so when you breathe out, right, when you exhale, some of what you're exhaling is water vapor, right? And so there's some amount of water that is made naturally in your body, but not the majority, right? Not the majority. So that's fluid intake, right? So you're bringing fluid in, 2,500 mils via, fluids and that you're drinking and eating, and then a much smaller number through that metabolic water. Now, you've also got fluid output, right? And so this is the loss of water from the body, right? So how much water is, or how much fluid rather is leaving, okay? So maybe somewhere around 1,500 is leaving via the urine, right? So during urination, and then the other 40% or so, so that's about 60%. The other 40% is through air that we exhale, right? So we just talked about, water is made as a byproduct. We exhale. Some of it is lost through sweat. Some of it is lost in our feces, right? But all this to say we're getting rid of a significant amount of water, and it's going to vary depending on conditions, right? So if you are exercising and you're sweating more, right, and you're losing more fluids and you're not replenishing those fluids, you're going to be losing more than you're bringing in. So you'll have fluid imbalance, and we'll talk about fluid imbalances in just a little bit, right? And then you can also have water loss based on a couple of different factors, right? And so these are called sensible and insensible, and this has to do with whether or not the water that is lost is measurable. Okay, and then you have two additional ones called obligatory and facultative, and this is based on whether or not the loss is regulated by your hydration status, right? So let's first look at sensible and insensible. So these again have to do with, can you measure the amount of fluid that's being lost, right? Can you measure it, right? So when you think sensible, insensible, think measure, right? Can you measure the amount of fluid that's being lost, right? Sensible, you can measure it, right? So there's a significant enough of this significant amount of this fluid that you can actually physically measure it, right? You can measure it. This is fluid that is lost in the feces, and this is fluid that is lost in the urine, right? Insensible is that amount of fluid that is lost still, but it's such a small amount and it's lost in such small quantities that it's difficult to measure it, right? So when you exhale, right, when you exhale, there's some volume of water, there's some amount of water that's lost when you exhale, but it's such a small amount and it's lost in such a small kind of quantity that it's actually difficult to measure, right? Sweating as well, right? Now, you've got two other ways to talk about fluid output, and this is obligatory and facultative. And so again, this is based on your hydration. Okay, so obligatory, think obligatory, the water is obliged to leave, it has to leave. So this is loss of water that's always occurring. Okay, so every time you exhale, right, every time you breathe out, there's some amount of water vapor that leaves. Okay, you are always sweating to some degree. Okay, now you may not be able to detect it, right? So it may be kind of that insensible loss, right? It's not measurable. It's such a small amount, but you're always losing some amount of fluid through the skin, right? And so again, that would be something like insensible perspiration, and then the fluid that we lose through our feces and urine, right? That's always going to occur. We're always filtering our blood. We're always producing filtrate and tubular fluid, and thus urine. And then we have fluid that gets that remains in our GI tract, incorporated into our feces, and then defecated out. Right. So that's obligatory. It's always occurring. Facultative is based. Facultative water loss is based on whether or not you've got some other factor that's controlling the water loss, not water loss that is inevitable. It's always going to happen. So it's going to depend on your hydration. Okay. And so a lot of this, think about it in the context of hormones, right? So think of our different hormones that we've talked about that help to regulate water loss, right? So think aldosterone, right? And again, for each of these, think about where it comes from, right? And what it's doing and how that affects fluid volume in the blood and the kidneys, concentration, things like that. So we've got aldosterone, we've got antidiuretic hormone, right? So ADH, and then think ANP, right? That atrial natriuretic peptide, right? So all of those are helping to control water loss depending on our hydration status, depending on fluid volume, things like that, right? So again, you can see here different ways of talking about fluid intake and output, right? So normally there's a pretty good balance between this. If you go to work in a hospital setting, maybe you're working as a nurse in a medical surgical unit or something. Patients who are, maybe they have hypertension, they have congestive heart failure, you will be required to take something called I's and O's, right? Take the patient's I's and O's, strict I's and O's. I's and O's means intake and output. So you are measuring, you are recording everything that the patient consumes, all of the fluid that they intake, and you're also measuring, again, that sensible amount of fluid. You're measuring the fluid output as well, right, to help ensure that there is an adequate balance and that they're not retaining additional fluid, so that they, intake 2,500, but their output is only, 1,500 or 2,000. In that case, they would have retained that extra amount of fluid. Right? So that's kind of normal fluid intake, normal fluid output. We're going to stop here, and what we'll look at in our next part is talking about fluid imbalance, when there's either too much fluid that's being brought in, or too much or not enough fluid that's being put out of the body.